Maybe you've heard of tilt-shift lenses, but aren't sure how they work or why you'd use one. I'm going to tell you all about them on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions. Don't forget to go to askdavidbergman.com. Submit your own photo questions right there on that site. I just might pick it to answer here on a future show. Also, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button down below. Use the little bell icon. You'll be notified as soon as new photo shows come out from myself and the other photo hosts all week long right here on Adorama TV, just for you guys. Today's question was sent in by Joe P., and Joe wants to know, you had a recent video about tilt shift versus macro lenses, and I was wondering if you could go more in-depth about tilt shift lenses. How do you use them and what are they used for? Now, by definition, a tilt shift lens is, of course, a lens that's able to physically tilt and shift. What that actually means is that since the lens projects a wider image circle onto the sensor, almost like a medium format lens does, you can bend the light in interesting ways and capture some unique images. Here is the Canon tilt shift 90mm lens. And these lenses are all manual focus, these tilt shifts. I also have the 24 tilt shift as well. And they have all kinds of knobs and things on them, right? So you've got all these knobs where you can control things. And these allow you to bend the lens and move the lens around. And it also has tension locks on there so you can lock things in place how you want them. Now, most tilt shift lenses, I believe all of them, I know the Canons are all manual focus. There's no autofocus on these lenses. If you're working on a tripod, it's best to use the zoom function in the viewfinder if you're using a mirrorless camera, so you can zoom in and really make sure you're focused on exactly what you want, because you might have a very shallow area that's in focus. So use that zoom function. If you're using an optical camera, use live view if you have it. If you're shooting without a tripod, you just got to use your eyes and manual focus like we did back in the old days. So what I'm going to do is go through the different functions separately on the lens, because they're actually used generally for different purposes. The first one is, of course, tilt. What tilt does is it changes the plane of focus. Now, when we talk about depth of field and the plane of focus, what we're referring to is how deep that focus plane is, and it's normally parallel to the sensor. So here's the camera. The camera sensor is in the back of the camera. It's straight on the back here. And normally, on a normal lens, our focus plane is parallel to that. The light comes through the lens straight, and it's going to be parallel. So that plane of focus is going to be in focus, parallel to that sensor. And the image is going to get more out of focus the further you go in front of or behind that plane. But again, it's going to be parallel to the sensor. But when you tilt the lens, let me show you what that looks like, right? So you take the lens and you can actually tilt it up and down. So that's tilt up and this is tilt down. And now the light coming through there is no longer coming through parallel to the sensor. So it changes the direction of the light and the plane of focus. It still exists, but it's no longer parallel to the sensor. So I'm going to show you some pictures so you can see how this works. When I was in Central Park with Angie for last week's video, I also made some images of her with this 90mm tilt shift. Now, without any adjustments, it's just like a normal lens. I was able to manual focus on her eyes, and at 2.8, you can see that her face and her body is in focus, but the bricks in the background, which is about a foot or two behind her, have gone out of focus, exactly how you'd expect. Now, when I tilt the lens down, right, so I'm tilting the lens this way. I'm tilting it down like that. What happens is, now that I focus on her eyes, her body is going to go really out of focus. But take a look at the bricks up at the top. Those bricks are in focus way up at the top. Not the ones behind her, but the ones up at top. Now, if you think about where the focus plane has moved when I tilted the lens down, it runs up from her eyes to the bricks over her head. So again, normally it's like this, right? She's standing here, the sensor is here. So what I'm doing is tilting the focus plane like this. So anything in this area now is going to be in focus. So if you think about where she's standing, her eyes and the top of the bricks, right? The very up high above her are going to be sharp, and then her eyes, but her body, which is now behind the focus plane, is going to go way out of focus. So that's why you get that really unique look. Once you start moving that focus plane around, you can get really cool with this stuff. Now, when I tilted the other direction with the lens up and focused on her eyes, then the bricks up top are way more out of focus, more so than in the normal photograph, and the ones down below her are much more in focus. Now, you can't see those, but you can tell that they are because by the back of her shoulders are starting to get sharp, and you can imagine that line continuing down behind her. It's really pretty cool stuff once you wrap your brain around how it's working. Now, there are some calculations if you want to figure out exactly how far the focus plane moves and depending on how much you tilt, but I'm not going to get that deep in this video. I just want you to see the direction that it moves when you do tilt the lens. Now, you also may have seen images that have that cool miniature effect. Everything looks like a miniature. That's created by using a tilt shift lens. Of course, you can do that in the computer, but it's not as realistic as doing it optically. Now, besides appearing to minimize depth of field, you can also tilt the lens to maximize depth of field. Maybe you have two things that are far apart with one in front of the other, and you want both of them to be in focus. Now, you could close down your aperture to have a deeper depth of field to try to get both of them sharp, but maybe you don't have enough light to do that, or you want to avoid diffraction that happens, which is a loss in quality when you shoot at really small apertures. Or what if you still want everything else to be out of focus and just those two items to be sharp? Well, all you have to do is simply tilt the lens to get that plane of focus on both items. Because you can rotate the lens all the way around, you can choose exactly where that focus plane is so you can get both items in focus. You can even get super weird like I did in these next images. By rotating the lens so the tilt was left and right instead of up and down, I could get one of Angie's eyes in focus while forcing the other one out. If you look closely, you can see the plane of focus runs vertically and everything left and right gets thrown way out of focus. So that's tilt. Now let's talk about shift. The shift function physically moves the lens up and down, or really any direction since you can rotate the lens as well. So you could go left, right, up and down, or even diagonally. This actually allows you to capture parts of the image that would normally be outside of the viewable area. And since you don't have to move the camera, you're keeping the camera still, this allows you to avoid any distortion that would happen, especially with a wide-angle lens like this 24mm tilt shift. Let's take a look at this photo of the Midtown Manhattan skyline. I use that 24 here without any adjustments. Now, because I'm on the ground, I have to point my camera up to get the top of the buildings, right? So I'm standing here straight, and I actually have to tilt up the whole camera and the lens to be able to see the tops of those buildings. Now, what happens when you do that is the buildings are going to start to lean into each other, right? The tops of the buildings are kind of further away at that point because of the angle I'm shooting at. So it's kind of like looking down train tracks. They're eventually going to converge on each other. And that's called keystoning. And if you're an architecture photographer or you're the architect who happened to have designed any of those buildings, you really want all those lines to be straight up and down. And the only way to do that with a wide-angle lens is to keep the camera perfectly level to the ground, basically perpendicular to the ground. Now, if you could somehow get into the air about halfway up the height of the skyline, then you could point the camera straight and get the buildings without any keystoning. But that's probably not going to happen unless you're in a helicopter or you're flying a drone, which we can't do in Midtown Manhattan anyway. So I'm going to be shooting from the ground, and that's what most of us are going to be doing. Now, leveling the camera out from the ground, I've got way too much ground and can't see the tops of the buildings. But now with a tilt shift, I can actually shift the lens. Let me show you what that looks like. So the shift function, let me level out the tilt first. So I'm shooting like this, and the shift, what that does, it actually moves the entire lens up and down. It's not like bending it, it's just shifting it up and down. The tilt is the bend, and the shift is just kind of the move, right? So when I do that with this picture, by keeping the camera level and then shifting the lens up, just like magic, I can now capture the buildings all the way to the top, and all of the lines are straight because I'm not tilting the camera. I'm only shifting the lens. That's really handy for any time you would normally aim the camera up or down because it's going to make everything look a bit more natural. You can do this in post if you didn't capture it that way. Programs like Capture One happen to have really good keystone correction, but when you do that, you're throwing away some pixels, and you're really going to lose some image quality. So you're really better off getting it right in camera if you have that ability. There's also something else that you can use the shift function for, and that's to create panoramic images. If you shoot multiple overlapping photos by simply turning your camera, right? You shoot left, center, right, and actually turn your camera. Just like when you go up and down, there's going to be some parallax issues that are going to make stitching more difficult. And the parts that overlap, they're not going to be exactly perfect. And the computer's going to have to skew the images and really mess with the images a bit to get them so they line up properly. But if you've got a tilt shift lens, you can leave the camera in the same place and shoot 3 images, center, left, and right, or center, top, and bottom. If you rotate the lens, of course, you can go any direction you want, and then they're going to match up so much better. They're going to be perfectly aligned when you stitch them together. My friend and fellow Canon Explorer of Light, Joel Grimes, is known for actually photographing people by having them stand very still and shifting the lens to shoot overlapping photos. I copied that idea for a video a few years ago and made this image of Erica. Because it's multiple images combined, it's very high resolution and also uses the sweet spot in the lens for the highest possible image quality. Now, of course, you can tilt and shift at the same time if you really want to get creative. It's a lot to think about all at once, but opens up a whole world of new possibilities. Tilt shift lenses are not something that everyone's going to have in their camera bag, but it's a really great lens for specific uses, and you can always rent one if you want to try it out. Do you have a tilt shift lens? How do you use it? Let me know down in the comments below. I want to hear how creative you guys are with this lens and how you're doing it and what kind of pictures you're making. Remember, if you want your question answered on the show, just like Joe did today, go to AskDavidBergman.com, fill out that form, and I will pick the best ones to answer on the show. I'll be back here next week, every Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern, right here on Adorama TV with a brand new question. I hope you'll join me next week right here on Ask David Bergman.